Hello, friends. It's Ashlyn Brady here, and I have a short ghost story to read to you from over 100 years ago. It was published in a newspaper from Port Phillip in Victoria, Australia in 1845. The story is called An All Hallows Eve Party and was written by Miss Beale. Naturally, in some places, the writing has older expressions of the English language. Polly is the name of the lady in the story. She recounts her scary experience of meeting the ghost of John Lewis on Halloween night. The audience in the story includes a footman who is not impressed by the tall tale told by a Welshwoman. But Polly was a happy woman from meeting the handsome spirit. Please enjoy. An All Hallows Eve Party. Well then, I will tell you what happened to myself some 60 years ago. You must know that we Welshwomen have got ways of finding out what we are most anxious to know on this night when the spirits and goblins are about us more than any other night of the year. As I said, some 60 years ago, I and 2 or 3 other young women sat up together and waited for 12 o'clock. According to custom, we laid the cloth upon the table, turned the knives and forks and spoons all upside down, and everything else that could be turned the wrong way, sure enough, we turned it. When we had done this, we all sat down by the firelight to watch. 'Tis a weary and terrifying thing to sit up late, as still as death, not daring to speak, turning your eyes from the clock to the door and from the door to the clock, counting the minutes and looking for a spirit till he comes. Perhaps you never did, but 'tis an awful thing, as many here can tell. I never felt so strange as I did that night, before or since, but once, and that was when I went to the church to hear who was called. But I'll tell you that by and by. There we sat, getting paler and paler, as the hands of the clock pointed nearer and nearer to 12. 'Twas a very blustering night, just like this, and every time the door creaked with the wind, I thought it was a spirit. But I remembered afterwards that spirits don't make a noise when they move about. But how the rain pattered against the window, the very panes seemed to answer it and help to make it more terrible. And then the wind, oh dear, I thought the house was coming down about our ears. We waited and waited, shivering and shaking for fear, till the clock warned for 12. I looked at my companions and they at me, but we didn't dare to speak, for speaking frights a spirit off directly. The 5 minutes ticked slowly away, and every tick went all through me, when 12 o'clock began to strike. I stared at the door, and before the clock had done striking, I saw the door move. Yes, don't look as if you didn't believe me. I saw it move. That wasn't all, for it slowly opened, and then I saw a man's hand, and then an arm, and then a whole figure. Hey, don't look so unbelieving, Mr. Footman. You, a whole figure, and a very fine one too. Whatever you may think. I should have screamed, but I was afraid. So I stared with all my eyes, for I couldn't help it. The spirit looked at me very pleasantly, and up he walked to the table as plain as ever I saw anybody walk in my life. He turned every knife and fork and spoon and dish back the right way whilst I was looking at him. Well, I shall know you again anywhere, thinks I. He had on a blue coat and yellow buttons, a very smart frill to his shirt, with a collar and handkerchief as stiff as starch could make 'em, and he had brown hair, combed smooth and nice, and black eyes, and a nose and mouth, and every feature quite right. When he had settled the table, he looked well at me, and smiled as agreeably as if he had known me 50 years. And says I to myself, I never saw you before. Anyhow, I wonder whether I shall ever see you again. I was so sure at last he was a real man that I was just beginning to speak when he vanished away. I don't know how. I looked at the door, and it was closed shut. And then all around the room, but there was no man to be seen. There were 3 girls, and the sight of them called me to myself, for I had never thought about them all this time. They hadn't seen any spirit, but said I looked so wild and strange, and stared so hard they were afraid I was bewitched, but they hardly believed me when I told them what I had seen. For some time after this, I went on thinking day and night about the fine young man, but as nothing came of it, I got tired of thinking at last, and began to fancy that All Hallows Eve was no more than any other eve after all. But I found out it was worth all the other evenings of the year put together, and I'll tell you how I found that out. One Sunday, I and 2 of the girls that watched with me went to chapel. When I was there, I just chanced to look around. 'Twas when they were giving out the hymn, for I wouldn't have thought of looking about me any other time. And what do you think I saw? Guess. Now, guess again. Here Polly paused and looked exultingly around her. "Not the man," breathed the footman. "Yes," resumed the elated old woman, "the very man. There he stood, the spirit John Lewis himself. He was looking at me with all his eyes, and no sooner did I see him than he smiled at me just as agreeably as he did All Hallows Eve. I nudged my friend's arm, and says I, 'That's he.' 'That's who?' says she. 'The spirit,' says I, and sure enough he was there. Blue coat, yellow buttons, frilled shirt, starched collar and handkerchief, smooth hair, black eyes, nose, mouth, chin and all. I see him now. Oh, he was a handsome man, John Lewis. I couldn't help glancing around at him sometimes. How could I? And he was always sure to be staring at me. He went out of chapel first, and when I came out I found him waiting outside, and he began to talk to me at once, quite natural." "What, without being introduced?" interrupted the footman. "Ay, to be sure, and what's more, before that day 3 months we were man and wife, and never was a happier couple. We lived together nigh 60 years, and he has been dead, poor man, 5 years come next January. And all that story's as true as I sit here, and nobody knows it better than myself." With this emphatic conclusion, Pally drew herself up and looked for applause, with as much certainty of obtaining it as a prima donna. The company, most of whom had known the story from the cradle, were quite as much delighted to hear it again as if they'd never heard it at all, and still more enchanted were they at the astonishment of the footman, who could not conceive how anybody could tell such a story of her own particular self. Written by Miss Beale.